be starting with our second series in the webinar on coastal and risk to communities, people living in the coast. But before that, I would like to introduce and also call András to give a keynote talk. So Professor András is a hydrologist by training. He's a professor of water and environment policy at National University Public Services in Budapest. And as I said, he's also a chair of the Sustainable Water Future Program. And he served as the secretary of UNESCO's International Hydrological Program for more than 25 years, and later also as a rector of UNESCO IHE Institute for Water Education in Delft. So please, Professor András, could you please take over? And I would request him to come and give us the keynote talk.
Thank you so much, Smriti. I do hope that the PowerPoint came out all right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is a great honor to be with you, a distinguished panel that has been assembled. One item that is of particular importance, as it was already mentioned, is that next June we will be in midterm, right at midterm, in implementing the SDG goals. And there will be a full-fledged intergovernmental conference in New York at the UN, and perhaps the results of our deliberations, particularly the major meeting, the regional summit, ought to be channeled into that process. Because water is one of the most important issues that will be discussed at that particular session. Today, we are looking at a somewhat narrow sense of water security, which is quite a complicated definition, as it has been agreed by the United Nations specialized agencies comprising the UN Water. Today, we will particularly concentrate on climate-related issues, such as water-related disasters, including the increased frequency of flooding, particularly in the context of the coastal zones and particularly in the context of sea level rise. The regional water cycle issues, whether we talk about South Asia or we talk about globally the hydrological cycle, I think, ladies and gentlemen, we have a problem here. We have a problem because unless we institute appropriate measures, water is going to be one of the major, if not the major issues in the rest of the century. And the take-home message, what I would like to leave you with, and I'll try to prove it in the coming 20 minutes, is that we have 100 years to change it. Because exactly 100 years from now, things probably will look like totally different. Why is that the case? Let us examine what are the drivers which are driving this process, the drivers. What are the regional changes? Same as in Southeast Asia, as many parts in the world. There will be two particular drivers I will concentrate in the coming minutes. One is the change in the population dynamics, particularly the population growth as we move towards the end of the 21st century. And the other one is climate change, which also has up to a large extent linkages to the population growth. Basically, what we have ahead as a major driver is this: how the population has changed ever since the so-called Industrial Revolution. It's a double exponential curve, what we see here. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were 2 billion human beings on the earth. We are, at the end of the century, there were 6 billion of us there, and now we have 7.7 billion human beings. In 100 years, by 2120, we will have, according to the fairly reliable population predictions, we will have 12 billion human beings on the earth. And that will cause major changes. Indeed, the curve that we have seen so far, which was a double exponential curve, is flattening out. It is approaching, it became a logistical curve, and it seems that we are approaching the upper limit, which is basically the survivability of human culture. 12 billion human beings is more or less the carrying capacity of the earth in terms of resources, in terms of land resources, and then what comes as a derivative to that, agriculture and water. Let us examine very briefly what are the impacts of these two major drivers. Of course, there are secondary drivers such as urbanization, land use changes, and many other things. But let us see what are the impacts of the population growth so far, and also the climate change so far, and what are the options what we have. The impacts of all these changes is that we seem to enter a new geological era. Because what happened ever since the Industrial Revolution is indeed a game changer. We have completely changed the hydrological cycle. There's hardly any part, perhaps Amazonia in some places on the earth, that are still pristine ecosystems. Everything has changed in terms of urbanization and the industrial pollution, so much that in certain environmental variables, we have reached the limits of the point of no return, as the pilots call it, beyond which we cannot go, otherwise our systems will collapse. There was a very interesting paper published in Nature by Rockström and colleagues some 10 years ago, 13 years ago. In those days, they have already identified 3 major areas where humanity went beyond, or the impacts of humanity's acts went beyond the point of no return, namely the biodiversity loss, namely the perturbation of natural flows is beyond the point of no return. And also they have flagged that we went beyond the greenhouse gas concentration. And for each of these variables, they have set certain limits. For instance, for the greenhouse gas concentration, they said 350 ppm. That's the limit. If we go beyond, then we will have a major problem. And these, ladies and gentlemen, we are now beyond that point because we have, 2 years ago, we have reached the 413 ppm. On the other hand, considering our subject today, the global freshwater use and utilization, in those days, that was 12 years ago, the water withdrawal was about 2,600 cubic kilometers a year, and the author set the limit of 4,000 cubic kilometer water withdrawal versus water use. That is the limit. So if we go beyond that, then things will be rather difficult. Now let us see where we are now. This is the time series of the water use over the, or rather I have to precise it, water withdrawal. This is the time series over the 20th century of water withdrawal. And we are seeing that we're almost there at the 4,000 cubic kilometer per year limit, with all sorts of very negative consequences globally, but also regionally. From our point of view today, which is coastal ecosystems and environmental degradation, perhaps the most important message we have to deal with, and this is really very dramatic, that 85% of the total wastewater that is being carried out by streams and rivers and ultimately ends up in oceans and in marine ecosystems, particularly the coastal ecosystems, 85% of that is going untreated into the coastal region, and that is causing major changes in terms of the biomass, in terms of the biodiversity of our coastal ecosystems. Another tragic news is that over the past 30 years, the freshwater species biomass has been reduced by 50%. There are many other alarming signals which are linked to water. For instance, every single year, there are 6 to 8 million people that are killed by water disasters or bad water quality. In our context today, this is what is called the H2 effects that indeed illustrate what happens, that all these river networks are carrying all the pollution down to the coastal areas and are causing major problems in terms of quality, water quality, and in terms of the ecosystem functioning. On the other hand, if you look at the climate impacts, the picture is very alarming. It seems that, and this is now statistically proven, the frequency of the extremes is increasing. This is the result of an accelerating hydrological cycle, which results in an increasing probability of the floods. But given the amount of fresh water in the world, the same as it has been at the beginning of the Holocene period, it means that the frequency of the droughts must also increase. And indeed, this is what we are observing. So these two phenomena are occurring at the same time: an increasing flood frequency against an increasing drought frequency. There are many examples that I could show. For instance, here in Europe, in France, a disastrous flash flood occurred in southern part of France. One day, 7 months of precipitation has fallen. Or last year, the news agencies were reporting the never observed flash flood in the western part of Germany, that even today is causing major problems. Same cyclone caused big havoc in Belgium or in Italy. So even in Europe, where the climate seemed to be rather stable, these things are occurring with an increasing frequency. The Indus flood the big flood disaster in 2010 in Pakistan has caused major problems. Or if you look at what happens all over the place in Asia. So these floods are increasing, and they will cause major changes in coastal systems, together with the expansion of the body of the ocean, if you wish, which results in sea level rise. So the combined effect of sea level rise and the increasing frequency of floods will be a major challenge. And yet there are some who are still considering climate as a matter of belief or non-belief. This is with us, ladies and gentlemen, ever since the Industrial Revolution, but it speeded up particularly during the 20th century. So some of the hydrologists are speculating that around 1920, the hydrological cycle became so unstable that it is perceptible now, and we can measure it. The negative impacts are all over the place. This is in Japan. This is not my photograph, but it shows a flood levee over tapping. There will be more floods as the Japanese hydrologists came to the conclusions. And indeed, if you look at the number of natural disasters over the 20th century, what you see here is that 80, if not 90% of the total disasters is water related. That green line, which is broken line, which is in here, represents the number of disasters which are caused by water. So water is the biggest killer, if you wish. Floods, and more importantly, droughts. And as I mentioned, the frequency of these events is on the increase. If you look at the global situation, the particular vulnerable places are the coastal zones. And this is basically the flood losses in function of the GDP, which is very, very much observable. Take that combined with the sea level rise, then we have a problem. What are the impacts then on these global changes which we are observing? One of the again, because of the human activities, the increasing number of the users, the increasing release of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. What we observed since the Industrial Revolution, just about here, this is the 18th century, was an exponential increase in the carbon dioxide release, resulting in an observable trend already in the global average temperature. And of course, this is not a huge observation window. The regular climate observations globally started about 150 years ago. So this is one of the challenges what science has, is that how do you make inferences long-term ahead from a finite window of observations that of course could be extended back through proxy observations. Nevertheless, what we see is that the anthropogenic nitrogen fixation is also showing an exponential increase. Nitrogen fluxes to the coastal zones do possess the same exponential character. The loss of tropical rainforest is also growing exponentially. Likewise, the species extension over the past observed period of 230 years is also exponentially increasing. So, ladies and gentlemen, everything seems to be increasing exponentially. My students used to observe that includes the number of McDonald's restaurants, well, which is also an exponential process. So, as a net result of it, we have to change our design methods, particularly in the context of the coastal zones, because age-old hypothesis upon which engineers are designing structures, coastal structures particularly, namely stationarity, that the statistical parameters of our processes do not change in time. We have the same mean value, the same correlation structure, the same spectral properties, the same distribution of the events. This is not true in an exponentially changing world. Very simply say, the future will not be the same as the past. Therefore, we have to observe, we have to establish and recognize new technologies. Luckily, technological development over the past 40 years has been incredible, both in terms of data capturing capabilities and in processing those data. Zillions of data a day, which I will come back in a minute. So in summary, this part of the talk perhaps could be best summarized in one sentence. Yes, indeed, we will have more floods and droughts in stock in the coming decades, which, if combined with the impacts of sea level rise, will cause major water resources problems, including seawater encroachment to the coastal aquifers, which are anyway overutilized. There are too much water extracted from the coastal aquifers. And then if the sea level is indeed rising, then the sea level, the sea water, the salty water, will encroach into those aquifers, making them unusable for generations to come. In conclusion, there was a question asked by a climatologist 40 years back, a colleague of mine at the World Meteorological Organization, who said that if you hydrologists can prove that the hydrological cycle is accelerating, then there is climate change. If it does not accelerate, there's no climate change. And dear colleagues, the problem is that it's already proven. The hydrological cycle is intensified, which is going to cause a big problem because there will be an increased occurrence of hazards related to the coastal zones. If sea level rise is combined with more floods and aquifer overexploitation, seawater encroachment, coastal biodiversity, then we will have a problem. What we see here, this is a slide which I have borrowed from an earlier IPCC report, which projected, and this was not a forecast, this was a scenario analysis, assuming that the same trends and tendencies will act in the future as they did in the past. Then somewhere along the end of this century, the temperature will be beyond temperature increase globally, average temperature between 1.8 and 6 degrees. This is basically the figure that has started the political discussions that led ultimately to the Paris climate agreement. Because if the average temperatures is going beyond 2 degrees, then we already have instabilities with the hydrological system. When it goes beyond 4 degrees, then we will have problems with sea level, and that will have major impacts on the functioning of our ecosystems. Unless political leaders sticks to the Paris Agreement, we will have major issues by the end of this century. Here is a simulation study which I have borrowed from an IPCC report, looking at pessimistic and optimistic scenarios. Even in case of optimistic scenarios, in Europe, the average temperature will go above 2 degrees, which is about the threshold. That is why we need to keep it under 1.6 or so. In the pessimistic scenario, it is about 6 degrees, and that is going to be a problem. Observations all point to the temperature anomalies, which we have never observed. So indeed, what we have reached now is a major decision point, a crisis where we have to decide whether we go beyond those planetary limits, which I have mentioned at the beginning of this talk, or we are able to stabilize the Earth's system. The conclusion, dear colleagues, is that climate change is all about water, whether it's sea level rise, or whether it's flooding, or whether it's aquatic ecosystems management. 80% of the impacts of climate change will be manifested through, with, and by water. Therefore, what we need to do, apart from the mitigation, which is a long-term process, we need to apply climate adaptive water strategies. So through appropriate water management, we can really deal. And that's the only way, by and large, the only way to deal with the vagaries of climate change. What we have to do, indeed, is to increase the resilience of our systems. It's not the stability. Resilience is a thing that shows that if your system is kicked out of equilibrium, it has the ability to return back to a relatively near dynamic equilibrium. So basically, what we have as a result, either we go where the water is, or we take water where we are, or we take an appropriate combination. So therefore, water engineering is very important. Of course, we are all for soft solutions, but one cannot avoid the use of engineering structures, and the adaptation options are quite a number. Humanity will need more storage. There is a paradigm change, perhaps you also observed, is that up until, say, 20 years back, the engineering paradigm was get rid of the excess water as quickly as possible. Now it has changed. Keep that water for those days where you don't have water. So manage that water, and you cannot do that without appropriate structures. So there's a great deal of great many options which we can apply. The important thing is that we need more storage, because this is the storage is the issue which combines food security, energy security, and water security. Last but not least, perhaps an optimistic message at the end, that in spite of all these difficulties, there is hope, because over the past 40 years, an incredible progress has taken place in science, environmental science, and technology. For instance, data secrecy, that upstream countries are not sharing data with the downstream countries, and the downstream countries know that the flood is coming when they will be flooded. With new technologies, particularly the satellite technology, this will be gone. We have now 20 plus satellites up there which observe remotely not only real time the precipitation fields, but we can also measure discharges in real time, or through this GRACE technology, which is measuring the gravitational anomaly. The Earth's gravitational field has changes, and then the reason is that if there's a big body, such as a huge groundwater reservoir, then the gravitational field is changing, and the satellite could measure it. And we can really establish systems which are integrated systems from Earth observation all the way up to decision support. And what is in between, and that's what the users don't see, what is in between is an incredible amount of science of the past 40 years. Every single day, we have an exabyte data coming from exabyte hydrologically relevant data that is coming from satellites. 1 exabyte is a billion gigabyte. So it's a huge amount of data that comes every single day with an incredible speed. 40 years back, our daily prayer was, "Oh Lord, make the world leaner and normally distributed, and we can do everything." But now that prayer is basically over, because we can compute almost anything, even at quantum level often, because we have the data to do that. As a net result, I think we need to retool our toolkit to water problems, coastal issues including. Water governance is becoming a very important issue. I used to say to my colleagues that when it comes to the exact science or engineering, 90% of these problems are solved. But when it comes to the social impacts of water management, 90% of the problems are still not solved. So we have to go beyond integrated water resources management. We have to establish a digital integrated water management at different scales, from local all the way up to global. And of course, the solution to this is interdisciplinary. Last, this is a somewhat reinterpreted version of the SDGs, putting water into the center of the 17 goals. I used to ask my students that if you have the 17 SDG goals and you have a choice to take out one, which would be the one that would then result into the collapse of the whole SDG system? And if the answer is not water and sanitation, then the person is flanked. Because we have really a shared responsibility all over the place, that the poorest are the most vulnerable. And when we are indeed facing a looming water crisis, we have to recognize that the time of easy water is over.
Thank you very much, Andreas. This is the first webinar of today, which is on protecting coastal ecosystems in South Asia. And I also invite all the speakers, and we look forward to it. So over to you, Andreas and Jency, who is also moderating. Yes.
Thank you so much, Miti. I think there will be a very logical continuation. What my dear old friend, who was a colleague of mine for 5 years at UNESCO IHE, Assela Pathirana, who is talking about the rising seas, particularly mapping the threats of the South Asian region. So Assela, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, András. I hope that everyone can hear me.
Yeah.
So before, yes, I think Jency wants to introduce Assela. to the participants as well. Many have joined. So Assela, if you would allow
No worries, go ahead, please.
the slide, and also to all the participants and to speakers who are joining now, especially to the participants whom I see joining now. We have a link to the webinar agenda and also the posters and also a mailing list and also the website to Future Earth in the chat box. So with that, I give it to Jency.
Thank you, Smriti. Thank you, Professor Assela, for joining us. So Dr. Assela Pathirana is a civil engineer and hydrologist originating from Sri Lanka. Currently, he works as an associate professor of water infrastructure asset management in the Department of Coastal and Urban Risk and Resilience at the IHE-Delft. He currently leads a research program on water-sensitive cities of flood resilience core group. He is also the chief technical advisor to UNDP. The floor is yours, Dr. Assela.
Okay, thank you very much. And my special thanks to András, because he made my life of making this presentation hopefully within 15 minutes very easy, because András, you gave the helicopter view of the problem. So I can now go into a little bit of details, especially looking at some of the case studies that might interest the audience today. So I'm going to talk about 3 case studies. They are not all from South Asia, but they are extremely relevant for the conundrum we are facing in South Asia. I'll promise that this is the only global trend I'm going to show you, because András did an excellent job laying out the problem. But the recent IPCC report, assessment report 6, was out end of the last year and this year, various working groups. And we see a very scary image. By 2300, sea level rise greater than 15 meters cannot be ruled out with high emissions. Now, we are hopeful on the one hand, but on the other hand, we are a world today. Instead of worrying about 21st century problems like this, we are trying to fight 19th century wars. So, yeah, this is a real possibility. So we'll come to that later as well. But the first point I want to discuss with you about this town or city called Kantha in the middle of the Mekong Delta, that is in the southern Vietnam. Those of you who are not familiar, Mekong River flows all the way from China down to the Indian Ocean through several countries, the last one of which is the Vietnam. So that is where I'm focusing on. So this is a very interesting place when it comes to climate change and the future change, because what András was talking about earlier, that is different aspects of climate change on the water cycle, all are impacting this city in a very serious way. First, you have the upstream flow. It's a huge river that is coming all the way from China with its all geopolitical complexities, the climate change impact, the land use change, everything. So the flow upstream is changing. Sea level is obviously rising, but at the same time, population in the city is changing and the demography is followed by changes in the land use. So all these 3 pressures are impacting on this system at the same time. So as a result, one of the many problems the city is facing, by the way, another problem is water quality issue, which is combined with this flooding problem is a serious one, but flooding is recognized as one of the major urban problems that this city is facing. So some of the pictures I will just, exactly around 10 years ago, we published a paper that was widely cited, where we tried to use the best possible modeling tools, a kind of chain of models to see the prognosis for the city regarding flooding in the future. And the picture we saw was somewhat scary, but that is about the prognosis about the future. But what can we do about this? One of the recent activities we did, we believe that, the keynote speaker was also talking about, the importance of multidisciplinarity and people understanding professionals understanding what each other is talking about and what they are doing. So one aspect that we want to do in this context was, bring this sophisticated state-of-the-art modeling to a level where, non-modelers, non-engineers can understand, appreciate, and also co-design things together. So towards that end, we started with our very complex models for this Mekong Delta and the Kantha city, and we started making it into a very simple but still representative modeling system. So using this modeling system, so it's a simplified system for the overall area, but we focus on where it matters, this city, and we can compute flood inundation under various past, rainfall and high river flow and sea level events, as well as for the future. So making it together with the IPCC scenarios, we could see what the future of this city is going to be like under different IPCC scenarios. So you can see that under certain extreme scenarios, the city will practically vanish. So in this point, what we really wanted to do, when it comes to adaptation, we very strongly believe that the modeling and the engineering calculation should not be the territory of engineers and modelers alone. In the complex world we are living in today and the complex problem we are trying to address in climate change and the other changes in the future, we need the multidisciplinarity. So for that, one of the very important requirements is that people should be able to understand what each other is doing. So towards that end, we started creating this series of web applications. This is one of them that we created for the Kantha city, but we have a number of them where we really invite the colleagues from other domains, politicians, policymakers, as well as general public to see, in a safe, in a user-friendly environment, to explore various what-if scenarios. What will happen to your city, to your delta, to your area, to your coastal environment in the future under different climate change and other scenarios. So that is my first story. And the second story is also from Vietnam. That is, here the point I want to raise is that climate change is something, it's not about future anymore. This story is from the water supply of the Ho Chi Minh city, a largest city in the south in Vietnam. And due to the combination of sea level rise and the attenuation of the flow in the Saigon River that flows through the city's water supply system has started become saline in the dry season. So by 2016, the water company and the Vietnamese government decided that we have to do something about this because it's already, it's not a problem of the future, but it's an acute current problem now. So together with these people, we organized a series of co-design workshops. Again, why I selected this is that I really believe that when we are trying to address these complex problems, this kind of co-design approaches, communication with each other, trying to understand what each other is doing is extremely important. It's non-negotiable. If we are to do something, if we are to have a hope about adaptation to climate change and the other changes that are happening around us. So we created a 1-week workshop, which was very interesting, and where we did desktop work, design, field work, things like that, came up with a lot of interesting ideas. And as a result, now the Vietnamese government is following integrated short, medium, and long-term adaptation pathway set for this problem. Now, again, this problem is not unique to Ho Chi Minh City or to Vietnam. This is a problem that is happening all over the world in the coastal areas. Especially, I know that in South Asian countries, I have worked with Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh, Maldives, all the places in one form or the other, this water security challenge is manifesting itself, showing us the impact of climate change is here. So with that, I will go into my third story that I want to point out, which is a very different one. Some of my work in the last 2 years in the Republic of the Maldives, together with the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change there, and the UNDP in the Maldives. So here, again, what we see is that extremely vulnerable country. The entire world knows about the story of Maldives, that Maldives will vanish from the earth if we talk about sea level rises that I mentioned in the beginning of the talk. Extremely small islands. We can call them tiny island. Actually, the definition of small island is much bigger. This country has about 1,200 islands, where about 190 are inhabited. So it's a logistical nightmare when it comes to provide services for all these islands and provide infrastructure, manage them. So even without climate change, it's a very difficult and challenging situation indeed. But with climate change, we are increasingly seeing a big problem, because this is a typical cross section. Mind you, it's very much exaggerated vertically, so it's much thinner than what I have shown here. Underneath these very flat islands, you have what we call a freshwater lens that is literally floating over seawater in the groundwater, which is roughly about 2 to 5 meters deep. That's it. And that's the entire water system these islands have. So they don't have any catchments, so to speak, any reservoirs, canals or rivers, nothing. This is the only freshwater reservoir they have, and it's very dynamic, very fleeting. And one season with low rainfall is enough to deplete it practically to zero. So what is happening in these islands, in these outer islands of Maldives, is that at the moment people are using mainly rainwater harvesting, because even the groundwater, the little freshwater that they have in the freshwater lakes, is heavily contaminated. So they are using rainwater harvesting, but as András pointed out, hydrological cycle has accelerated, and we get very heavy rainfall once in a while, but in the dry season we get little rainfall, and droughts are getting longer and longer. As a result, rainwater harvesting is challenged, and because of that, the government has to provide dry season emergency water supply at a great cost. So here what we are talking about is, in a country where the median monthly family income is about $1,300 the government spends around $170, $180 per cubic meter of emergency dry season water supply. It's extremely expensive. So at the moment, with the help of Green Climate Fund, together with the government of Maldives and the UNDP and other entities, there are work going on how to mitigate this problem. One approach is, create a bit better rainwater harvesting systems that are, safer and also much larger in volume storage, and that's the first step, looking at it. And then there is another approach, that is, you are trying to combine the rainwater harvesting together with desalination. Desalination is a controversial topic, but for some of these islands, there is no other solution at the moment, but we are trying to make it as environmentally friendly as possible. On the one hand, by mixing the water with harvested rainwater as much as possible. On the other, using renewable energy for this huge energy cost of desalination and several other aspects. And looking at the future, there are other synergies to be had in this system. For example, you can start creating brine-related products rather than discharging the brine into the ocean, which is an environmentally questionable practice. And how to close the hydrologic cycle by recharging the excess water from rainwater harvesting into feed into this valuable freshwater resource that is very limited. So this kind of activities are happening at the moment. So before I go into conclusions, I want to show you another extra slide that I kept actually after the conclusion, just in case, but I really want to bring this up because of the discussion, the relevant discussion that happened in the keynote. It's not all gloom and doom for the humanity, because there are very interesting developments happening. And if we synergize them together, especially the development, on the one hand, developments in the artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the big data domain that András was talking about. The second is, we are seeing a plethora of monitoring methods. András was talking about the satellite data and how much of a bandwidth of hydrological relevant data we are getting it. That's one aspect. The other aspect is we are making strides in development of very cheap sense and easy to use sensors that people can use to create a lot of environmental and hydrological data. And together with that, I mean, getting people, engaging people to be citizen scientists will close the cycle. And I have great hopes that this kind of co-learning process, together with the contribution from the societies, leveraging the power of AI and the IT development, as well as development of cheap and free monitoring methods, can try to solve this problem. So with that, I will go back to my conclusions. I mean, these are, you should consider this as my informed but personal views. I mean, what I believe is what we need to know to act, we already know. With the AR6, Assessment Report 6, I mean, we know quite a lot about what might happen. I mean, we can all nitpick about how certain we are about, whether it's going to be 10 times or 20 times the magnitude of a forcing, but once you are drowned above your nose, you are drowned. So we already know what we need to know to act. And climate change is already with us. It's not a future problem. It's not a luxury to deal with, but it is something that's already with us, already challenging us. But it's going to be a lot worse in the future unless we act on that. And for the short and medium term, like I showed in the Ho Chi Minh City example, we need adaptive planning. That is, with the uncertainty that we are living in, again, the keynote speaker mentioned about the resilience. So that is the ability to deal with the system, as we say, hell or high water, whatever conditions come in the face of us, we can deal with that. So, create systems like that. That is about adaptive planning. But today, we will be ignoring our duties if we don't say that at some stage we may need beyond adaptive planning. We may need transformative changes, because that somewhat scary picture I showed you in the beginning about 15-meter sea level rise is a possibility, even though 15-meter is very low probability, but it's possible. So for that, then we are talking about a different Earth system, different coastal areas. And, then we have to look at radical changes unless we act quickly. And finally, the simulation models, And these techniques has been the ivory tower of a limited group of people. We used to play with them, but today we have recognized that they can be very good communication tools indeed. So use them wisely to create a following for the climate adaptation. For climate change, I think we have created a following, even though once in a while we see anomalies at different parts of the world, denying climate change and so on. But that noise will continue. But we have accepted that for a fact. But now we need to create a following for the climate adaptation, and for that, bringing these models as future simulations, future visions of the world in accessible way can be a very useful tool in our arsenal to create that following. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Assela. We had a number of very important messages which you have displayed, particularly in the context of the small islands and the need for adaptive water management in times of climate change, which is undeniable. I'm just wondering whether does anybody have a quick question, or you would like to have the discussion at the end of the session?
Professor András, we can have the question and answer round at the end of the session.
Very good. So then we move on to the next presentation, thanking Assela for this brilliant talk. So the next presentation will have a much stronger social, or if you will, social science component, because it will deal with protecting the coastal communities and enhancing water security. So the next speaker is Dr. Utin, who is a retired Deputy Director General of the Irrigation and Water Resources Management Department in Myanmar. Perhaps if you could share your presentation, that would be a good start. It's coming. Excellent.
Hello. Good evening to everybody. I am the Mr. Tint from the Myanmar. I am the retired from the Water Utilization Department from Myanmar. This is our country. This is our country location. This is sustainable city and community for the affected coastal land and lowland area community in Myanmar. This is our country. Our country population is 54.82 million. For this coastal area, this is a Rakhine state, this is a IHE-Delta, this is a Yangon city, this is the Bago region, 4 township, and this is a Maung state, this is a Tenassery coastal. This area is affected. These are 22.147 million populations. For this area, the Yangon is the very population density area. This is a water security and rice production effective coastal and lowland area. We are in the area. Irrigation facility is totally 300. The irrigable area 0.27 million hectares. Embankment length is 2,267. Flood protected area is 0.77 million hectares. Sea dike is totally 988. The flood protected is 1.4 million hectares. The rice grown area in this area, when the monsoon and summer, totally 4 million hectares. Rice production is in this area 50.38 million metric ton. This is 57.64 of our country production. And the second crop is black gram and green gram, produce 2.52 million metric ton. It is 50% of our country production. Another crop is the maize, groundnut, sesame, the vegetables, the jute, all. Another fishery industry, marine fishery is 6.01 million metric ton per year. Aquaculture is 1.145 million metric tons. This fishery is 0.034 million metric tons. And also the other, the open fishery in this area. This is a clean water and sanitation in this area. This is the water beneficiary is all the state and region. About 70% the people are covering the 70% of the water supply system. The sanitation state is the Yakai is the bed. This is only 23% coverage of the sanitation, and also the tenancy region is 59.5%. I think so. This data is not updated in 2015. The UNICEF data, the water supply data is updated. There's a life below the water, the marine fishery and freshwater fishery in coastal and lowland area. In the shore fishery, this is our marine fishery area. Offshore fishery coast line are 2,832 kilometers. Rakhine State, Delta, IHE-Delft, Yangon region, Bago, Mon State, and Tenassery region. Totally 2,832 kilometers, including the 800 islands in the Myek area. This is a marine fishery. This is a freshwater fishery. The Iari river is a 2,150 kilometers. Chinrin is 844 kilometers. Sit down is a 563 kilometers. Tanluin is 2,400 kilometers. This is for the freshwater fishery. And the production and the restoration of aquifer in coastal region. This is the feature of the IHE-Delft. I divided the three portions. This is the upper portion. Upper portion is 8 to 70 meters above the mean sea level. This is the start distribution. Danger of the riverine floods. Dikes are very important for this area. The moderate rainfall. Middle portion. Middle portion is 4 to 6 meters above the main sea level. Riverine and localized floods. The freshwater, we can get the freshwater in this area, and also tidal effects. We can use for the agriculture, tidal irrigation. Some area we use the tidal irrigation, no need power. Some area we use the pump, and also the fishing industry in this area. The lower portion, this is the disaster-prone area, low-lying area. The 1.5 to 2.5 meter above the mean sea level. The high rainfall, seawater intrusion, the boulder and coastal dike and sluice established in this area. And also another is the scarcity of the fresh water in this area. This is the salinity intrusion in the major river in IHE-Delft. This is Pathirana River. This is the seawater front line in the Pathirana. This is a seawater front line in Yazondong. This is a seawater front line in Htoo River. This is the Yangon. This is our old city. The Line River. Line River is near the Yangon city. This is in the summers. In summer times, the salinity water is many front of the Yangon city in this place. I want to explain our IHE River Basin. This is the IHE-Delft. This is the IHE River Basin. The IHE Basin, the largest river in Myanmar, 2,172 kilometers length, 41,000 square kilometers. It is 60% of the Myanmar territory. The annual discharge is 420 to 440 billion cubic meters. The 469 dam, weir, pump station and hydropower station on the upstream of the river. In the rainy season, in flood, damage the river bank, silt and clay deposit in the summer area, summer season, seawater intrusion. The selling water front is selling water in front from the sea. This is based on the seawater level rising, as well as the fresh water coming from flow from the upstream of area. According to the data of our department, the Sunita front line in the delta area is different year by year. This is depend on the water use policy, energy based, agriculture based, and drinking water based. Every year, sediment dispose the 100 tons of the delta area. Selling front water line in ARE region is a different year by year, 2020 and 2030 and 2018. Selling water intrusion in both surface and groundwater in Yangon region. This is the Yangon. This is our old city. In the minimum, selling water in front is in the rainy season. This is in the summer season. This is very in front of the Yangon city. This is groundwater condition in the Yangon, beside of the Yangon, in front of the Yangon. This aquifer is about EC is about 80. This aquifer about 140. This aquifer is about 21,000 EC. So very quite different. All the aquifers now are homogeneous, like as not like as aquifer. It is like as aqueducts. Good health and well-being. For this, our department every month, every year, we are tested the contamination in the arsenic in groundwater. So this township and this sample we are year by year. We collect the water sample water and test it for the arsenic contamination. This is a groundwater quality in ARE region, and this township and this township the groundwater are contaminated the arsenic in groundwater. In this area, we cannot use the groundwater because the groundwater quality is very slim. But we can use the groundwater in this area. We can use the fresh water from this area. This point. This is very near to on the sea bank. We drill up to the 700 feet. We get fresh water. Easy about 1,400. Very lucky for this area. The potential impact. The water security and food production and clean water. Maybe flood, storm, sediment, erosion banks. Drainage, damage the irrigation structure. Groundwater quality and drinking water scarcity. Navigation and transportation difficult. Stress on the fresh water, farmlands, soil failure. The sustainable city and communities need people settlement. Unsustainable urban and rural development. Health risks in the waterborne disease. Livelihood of the coastal communities. The potential impact on the life below the water. Decrease the production of fresh fishery, damage aquaculture and structure, degradation of the ecosystem, seawater temperature rise, the negative impact on the freshwater fishery, maintain the freshwater fishery water channel, ecosystem, aquatic organizing in marine fishery and biodiversity, the protection and restoration of the aquifer in coastal region, the seawater intrusion, transfer between the groundwater aquifers, overpumping, natural recharge catchments, artificial recharge. The enhancement of the plan for the water security, food production and clean water, irrigation structure, reinforcement and rising the dikes, boulders and embankments, new drainage and sluices, enlarge and dredge existing canal and sluices, develop fresh water, dams, pumps, wells, the water conveyance system to lower portion. Need the foreign direct investment, JECA, World Bank, ADB, QUICA, etc. Need automated flood warning system, information system to public, adequate financial support, conduct hydraulic and hydrological analysis to the reinforce to seawater rising and flood water capability, establish groundwater monitoring and seawater salinity station, measure for the easy pH and temperature, enhancement of the food productions, soil upgrade, need the soil upgrade, research saline resilience seeds, initiative on ground community, knowledge of the action programming, training, farmers capacity building and water management, build water treatment plants and rain harvesting, need the FDI in agriculture sector, seed mechanization and agro industry.
Excuse me, Mr. Tin.
The settlement the people lowland area with livelihood, new urban and rural establishment, safe water, sanitation, health, business, transportation, education, build the life level and alleviate poverty of the rural area, pure financial support. Enhancement plan in life below the water, rise the embankment of the fish ponds, treatment costs increase the brackish water, fence costs for ponds, reservoir, water channel, construction and disabled fishing, plantation, mangrove, financial support.
Excuse me, Mr. Tin.
Yes.
You have kindly note that you have 1 more minute left.
Yes,
to
yes.
conclude.
This is the groundwater condition at Yangon area. This is a groundwater, 20,000 groundwater used in Yangon area. This is a reservoir for the drinking water for Yangon area. This is monitoring to well for the groundwater salinity. This green line is the EC is 1,000, another 1,000. The yellow is 1,000 to 4,000. The pink is pink area is more than the 4,000. We are already tested for the monitoring system in Yangon area. And also that we need groundwater, measure seawater intrusion monitoring wells, control the water transferring aquifer, manage the aquifer screen setup to the drilling company and contractors, but we can't. Control over permit, but we can't. Recharge the area management, CD area summer paddy growing. Prior to drinking water, external 8 need the farm. Recommendation and conclusion, restoration and protection of the ecosystem, compensation of the coastal area, livelihood of the coastal community, enhancement of the water security in both drinking and irrigation, settlement of the affected people, initiate on ground community knowledge of nation, master plan on the coastal resilience, sustainable urban and rural development associated with health risks, safe drinking water, sanitation and transportation, regional collaboration to address them, pure input for food security, agriculture, fishery, irrigation infrastructure. Myanmar is all the concerned ministry. We are contribute for the protecting the coastal community and enhancing the water security. Thank you for my presentation. I was there on the last year, 2020, before our retirement. This is a very beautiful place, edge of our Delta, ARE Delta. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Rutin. Jancy, do you have any particular comments to make now, or we continue with the presentation?
We can continue, Professor.
All right. Before the break, we have the last presentation by Professor Sunita Facknath of Mauritius. The topic was the nature-based solution in improving infrastructural and ecological resilience, which is a very, very important topic indeed. Professor Facknath, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chair. I will share my slide and start off straight away.
Right.
Okay, just confirming if you can see my slides.
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair.
Okay.
So as you said, I'm going to talk about nature-based solutions in improving infrastructural and ecological resilience. And as you mentioned, Chair, water is at the center of everything, center of life, center of the SDGs. And we, Mauritius, we are a tiny island surrounded entirely by sea. So you can imagine the challenges that we face with all the water that's around us, a tiny island, landmass. But at the same time, it also gives us a lot of opportunities. Okay, can you see the change in my slides on the screen? I moved to the next slide. Sometimes I have a problem when I shift slides, it doesn't appear. Can you see my next slide?
Not yet.
Oh, okay, so there is a problem. In that case, I'm going to stick to this and not move to my slideshow, if you don't mind. Okay, so Mauritius, like all other small island states, is disproportionately affected by climate change impacts. So as we all know, there is sea level rise, increasing frequency and intensity of tropical storms, rapid explosive intensification of cyclones, erratic rainfall patterns, and warming air and sea surface temperatures. So we also have socioeconomic challenges such as high coastal population densities. In fact, our entire population of 1.3 million comes out to around 660 people per square kilometer, which is a very, very high density. Geographical isolation, high dependency on international markets, low resource abundance, all of which makes it very difficult to adapt to these climate change impacts. Just to tell you a little bit about okay, how do I move this up? Yes. For the climate change features, so our average temperatures have risen by up to 1.2 degrees centigrade compared to pre-industrial levels, and it's been projected that it would rise by 0.15 degrees centigrade per decade in the future. Our sea levels have risen at an average rate of 1.5 millimeter per year since 1950, and this has become 2.1 millimeter per year since 1987. All of which puts Mauritius 13th for disaster risk and 7th for exposure to natural hazards in the global ranking. These pictures will attest to the beach erosion that we see everywhere in our beaches, and that's due to sea level rise, of course, but it's also due to higher and stronger wave action that we're seeing more and more. Increase in ocean temperature has led to coral bleaching and coral degradation. So you can see this picture where you have these beautiful, colorful corals. Another one here, we have this beautiful orange one, and now what we see. Also, you can see in the lower picture here, the corals are all white and bleached and dead. We also see an increase in incidence and intensity of rains and cyclones, which lead to heavy rainfall events, causing flooding and landslides and waterlogging. We've heard this from previous speakers as well, so these pictures are familiar. We are seeing them more and more on television. This is a catastrophic event we faced a few years ago. Now, this is Port Louis, the capital city. And if you can see my pointer here, the sea is here on the extreme right. That's my extreme right. Okay, so the sea is here, and you can see the mountains in the background of this building. So basically, this is a bay, and a lot of rain over a very short period of time brought all the water down from the mountains. And it so happened coincidentally that particular day, there was an increase in wave action. So we had what we call as high waves on that day. So we have water coming down the mountains, and we had the sea level had increased. All the water then just met in Port Louis in the center here, and we had this catastrophic situation that you can see. I'll just give you a few more pictures just to show you. So we have this road, which has been basically converted into a river. So this is, again, a road which leads out from Port Louis up to the higher levels. So one side of the road had completely turned into a river. We also had quite a few casualties. Just to show you some more pictures of flooding in Mauritius. Again, this is essentially Port Louis, the capital city, and you can see the devastation. One more picture, just to bring it home. Some more pictures. Of course, it's not as bad as we have seen in parts of Europe, or as is actually happening in our neighboring country of South Africa, Durban. So it's not as bad as that, but we did have quite a few casualties. However, a lot of measures have been put in place by government. So now we have early warning systems for torrential rain. We have early warning systems for flash flood. So since these pictures now, we fortunately are not seeing these kind of catastrophes. But of course, that's just that moment. Things are getting worse, and we don't know what's going to happen. It's not only in the cities, we're also seeing saltwater intrusion into the coastal aquifers. The agricultural soil is becoming more and more saline and unproductive. Low-lying coastal areas are getting inundated. Wetlands are being drowned, mangroves are being affected, and livelihoods are being impacted. It's not just climate change. We also have a lot of man-made drivers. Construction of hotels, beach houses, and other constructions, either straight onto the beach or very close to the beach, is destroying the integrity of the beaches. Unfortunately, we have seen a lot of backfilling of wetlands for construction purposes. In fact, 90% of our coastal wetlands have been destroyed for this purpose. People are still constructing on drains and sewers, and this leads to blockages and further flooding. Boat channels have been created in reef flats, passes have been widened in reef fronts, all of which are damaging the reef, and they're also affecting the integrity of the beaches. Until very recently, people were still mining coral sands from public beaches, okay, for building of hotels, for getting a sand for beach reprofiling, or for beach nourishment after cyclones and storms. You also have unsustainable activities on private beaches, those which belong to hotels or residents. So what are the past measures that government have taken? So we have had coastal protection measures put in place since 90s, but these were essentially hard solutions, gray infrastructure. So there were concrete or stone sea walls, groins, rock armors, and gabion walls. There were only about 3.3% of ecosystem-based responses, 11.7% being hybrid solutions, which were both, as we say, hard and soft solutions. So at that time, it was a one-size-fits-all kind of response to coastal infrastructure solutions. And basically, it was just gabions. Almost 50% of the public beaches had long stretches of gabions constructed. On the western coast, because there are many high-end hotels and gabions are basically not very aesthetic, so many of the hotels constructed these structures underwater to hide them from view. So there were submerged breakwaters, buried gabions, and all of these soon were found to be unsuccessful. The gabions were destroyed by waves. The chicken wire that's used to actually construct the gabions, they rusted in the seawater, and then they broke down. The volcanic rocks that they contained spread onto the beaches, and the wire plus all these sharp rocks caused injuries to visitors. And in some places, the gabions just did not work. Okay? This forced the shift from hard responses to soft and place-specific solutions. So this was basically a trial and error that we went through in the early 90s. It was a learning by doing process. Fortunately, we also got external financial support, external expertise, technical know-how, and all of this accelerated progress in adapting and risk reduction measures for coastal protection. What did we learn from that? That hard solutions are less durable and more expensive in the long term. The top-down process, which was used at that time, is not very practical, simply because at the local level, there isn't sufficient resources to enforce the measures, to enforce legislation. So either we need a bottoms-up approach, or we need to have more of a holistic, collaborative kind of approach. We need to take on board even the local authorities and even the people living there. To do that, we need to enhance the capacities so that they have the autonomy, they have the know-how, they have the skills, there is sensitization and awareness raising. We also need a more participatory and inclusive approach. Of course, this is a very expensive thing, so we need a lot of private sector involvement. So it has to be public-private partnerships, unless, of course, we get external funding. And of course, it cannot be a short-term thing. It has to be a long-term adaptation perspective, not something in the short term just to stop beach erosion over the next few years, but a long-term perspective. As I said before, the international engagements, external support, all of these we have found are strong incentives, and they're also strong enablers. sometimes just trying to sensitize people and raise awareness doesn't work. We can have any number of talks, any number of seminars, any number of events of these kinds, but they don't always get the message through. So we need to have more demonstration projects. This will encourage people to adopt soft measures, nature-based options, and integrated solutions. So what were the nature-based solutions we have adopted and are adopting? Mechanical and manual beach reprofiling, beach nourishment, that is mainly to halt shoreline erosion and provide storm protection, gravel, revêtement, that's how to pronounce it in French, to protect against storm surges and high waves, construction of dunes in front as well as at the back, and the front ones, they defend against wave action and flooding from overwash, while the interior ones at the back, they provide high ground and protect against penetration of overwash and the damaging effects of scouring. The dunes have to be stabilized, and this is done with indigenous plants such as the Ipomia, the batatron. We have a lot of casuarina trees. So we, in fact, plant these. You'll see in many of our touristic pictures, you have a lot of casuarina, you have a lot of palm trees. So these are preferred. So planting and replacing of such trees. Coral restoration is another big thing for us. So a lot of work is ongoing. There are a lot of projects on coral restoration, especially in front of eroded shores. Now, these corals, of course, are very slow growing, but I'm happy to say that we have developed technologies in Mauritius. Our scientists have developed technologies for enhancing coral growth. So we have a large number of projects ongoing in many parts of Mauritius where coral restoration, coral recruitment work is ongoing. And of course, then we also need to have legislation. For instance, no vehicles on the beach, no mining of sand, no collecting live corals, no cutting down on trees, and so on. Laws exist, but we need to enforce them. And this has to be done at the local level. So enforcement of regulatory laws. So these are some of the pictures of what I just said. So you've got planting of trees, we've got the batatron, we've got sandbags, we've got mangroves in different parts. Other measures include, for instance, the earliest setback distance, which was only 15 meters from the high water mark for construction of buildings, has now been increased to 100 meters. Not just that, hotels have to compulsorily have tropical garden areas, basically planted areas, which separate the living areas from coastal leisure facilities. A lot of hotels are constructing artificial wetlands. This they do for stormwater runoff and flood protection, and also for wastewater treatment. And they do it so beautifully that it actually becomes part of the landscape of the hotel for tourists. So these two pictures that you can see, the top right and the bottom left, these are constructed wetlands. Okay, very attractive. Okay, the picture at the bottom here is a coral farm where corals are growing very happily and healthily. And there you have a dune. Planting mangrove bells in front of the gravel revêtement. We have 2 native species, and these are very quick growing, so mangrove reforestation with them. At the level of agriculture, the level of planters, we do have the problem of saltwater intrusion, like previous speakers have mentioned. Where water table is high, our planters dig a depression in the field to collect groundwater and rainwater. But in the coastal regions, they also use these little ponds, a picture is here, to test for intrusion of seawater. And it's an indigenous, measure. If they see tadpoles in the water, which means there's been no saltwater intrusion. So presence of tadpoles in the water is an indigenous method to indicate whether there has been saltwater intrusion or not. And if they do find saltwater intrusion, that is no tadpoles, then what our farmers do is they irrigate 2 or 3 times the normal amount with fresh water, of course. So the excessive amount of fresh water that they use for irrigation then helps to wash down whatever salt may have been taken up. So these are some of the indigenous practices that we see our farmers are doing. What are the benefits of these nature-based solutions? They have the capacity to better adapt to sea level rise and increasing amounts of stormwater. The living shoreline, they moderate the impact of waves and storm surges while also providing self-sustaining protection. The living systems like oyster beds, wetlands, salt marshes, they grow over time through trapping of sediments. And in that way, they can compensate for increasing sea level rise. But of course, concrete structures can't do that. So they are self-sustaining. Coral reefs, seagrass meadows, mangrove forests, beaches, sand dunes, sandbars, they all retain water and dissipate wave energy. They act as a buffer against tidal waves, storms, and coastal flooding. So restoration activities such as mangrove regeneration and dune naturalization can promote these natural ecosystem functions. Often increase the resilience of existing ecosystems, and they provide a wide range of benefits to these existing ecosystems. They're also easier to modify and adapt than the conventional concrete-based coastal defense structures. There are a lot of other co-benefits as well. For instance, they help in carbon sequestration. So not only adaptation to climate change, but also mitigation. They help in improving water quality, especially when we have all the plants and the vegetation growing. Erosion reduction, we have mentioned. They provide habitats for biodiversity. These are what we call the blue and green corridors. They provide support for fishery sector, particularly the mangroves. Improvement in public health through recreational facilities, recreational opportunities for citizens. The reduced use of concrete and thus save valuable resource, also aesthetically. So having concrete structures is not as aesthetic as having greenery around. And of course, all this greenery, all this attractive landscape, it also provides stable support, for our tourism industry. Okay, these are figures from the US that I got. Unfortunately, we don't have figures from Mauritius. It is just to show you that the cost benefits of nature-based solutions is in the side of nature-based solution. In other words, over a long term, it's cheaper, it's less expensive, I would say, to have nature-based solutions than to have concrete hard solutions.
Excuse me, Professor Sunita. Kindly
You
note that you
give me
have
1 minute?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, I'll try to wrap up. I'm trying to speak as fast as I can. Okay, we do have challenges and we have to understand them. So there is a lot of uncertainty about their long-term performance and cost effectiveness. We need to actually work that out. We don't even have standardized tools at the moment for measuring the long-term performance, costs, and benefits. And because they're site-specific, you can't have a one-size-fits-all solution. So therefore, you need to adapt and design these solutions for each case individually. Now, this means it makes it more expensive and also lengthy. And where you have both public and private sectors involved, then there is a bit of problem with regard to who's responsible for the maintenance and the ownership. Also, certain types of NBS require large areas of land to be really effective. And in a small country like Mauritius, land is just not available, or even if it is this much, too costly. So this makes the selection of these natural solutions over traditional engineered approaches quite unlikely if we don't have that land or we can't obtain it cost effectively. We do, of course, have the option of looking at it in a different way. So not only looking at just the pure economics side of it, but also looking at the wider environmental and social benefits, looking at also the intangibles, and that would then make it more cost effective and attractive. As our keynote speaker said, purely gray infrastructure, hard solutions is not the way, but purely nature-based solution also has its challenges. So the best would be a hybrid solution, a hybrid approach, I would say. So they provide a good compromise between the risks and benefits. For instance, the temporary hard infrastructure, because a natural approach can take time to establish. In the meantime, you can have a temporary hard infrastructure to temporarily reduce disturbances. You protect the hard infrastructure with the nature-based solution. So a kind of a mixed system, one protecting the other. You can have designs that are inspired by nature, because nature is not just either hard or soft. You have a mixture of the two. So one enhances the other. So we can have such designs that are inspired by nature, such that we have a synergistic effect of whatever measure we put in place, both soft and hard. And of course, we need to look at multiple lines of defense, which includes environmental features, which will complement hard infrastructure as well as non-structural measures. So a few pictures of our hybrid solutions, which are actually from Mauritius. So you can see the seawall, but you also have a kind of a sort of a garden, if you like to call it that. You have something here as well. Again, similar hybrid solutions here. You need to create the enabling environment. So you need to have the supportive policy and governance framework. And this has to recognize a full range of co-benefits. You can't simply take an economical cost-benefit approach. So it has to take the full range of co-benefits and a long-term perspective, consider the long-term trade-off, not just short-term, and prioritize multifunctional solutions. The decision-making criteria should be more holistic in nature and also take into account the goals of other sectors. So you have environment, you have recreational, public health, of course, there's climate change mitigation, spatial planning, the housing sector. So all the other sectors also have their input, and therefore the decision-making criteria should look at all of these. So all the range of stakeholders should be involved, even look at multiple funding sources, combining multiple interests such as biodiversity conservation, human well-being, water management, economic development, job creation, climate change adaptation and mitigation, and of course our regional and international commitments with respect to greenhouse gas emissions and voluntary guidelines. We also need to integrate nature-based solutions into other planning processes as a complement to other solutions. Research and innovation policy should encourage local government to set up pilot projects in order to contribute to the evidence base. The more it is science and evidence-based, the greater the likelihood of success. Identify the constraints and develop a toolbox to assist planners. Develop standardized monitoring and reporting protocols to evaluate long-term benefits and co-benefits, both tangible and intangible, and develop learning processes for good practice in all aspects of nature-based solutions. So in conclusion, we are all going back to nature in many aspects of our lives. Health, okay, we're talking of more outdoor activities and things like that. Food and agriculture, we're talking more in terms of eating fresh food, eating clean food, organic food, less pesticides. Agriculture, we are asking our farmers not to use synthetic chemicals like pesticides and fertilizers, rather use natural products. Recreation, we are more and more going into these kind of green tourism. Our living environment, we want to have more passive ventilation, passive lighting, not use too much of fossil fuel energy. So even our built environment, we want it to be as natural as possible. So we are going back to nature in many aspects of our lives. So even infrastructure and the built environment is catching up, and more of such nature-based solutions are being considered for infrastructural and ecological resilience. So ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention. I'm sorry if I've just rushed through, but well, that was the time I had. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it was an extremely interesting presentation. We had a great deal of recommendations that we could perhaps channel into the conclusions and into the December meeting. I think we are a little bit behind time, so if I may, I would suggest that we have a quick break now, 10 minutes, and then we reconvene.
Yes, Professor András. I think Dr. Ibrahim is also ready.
Well, thank you so much. So the next presentation will be on, we're still on small islands, climate change adaptation. Dr. Ibrahim Mohamed, please, you have the floor, or rather the display. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. Could you hear my voice and see my screen?
Perfect.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. So I'm really, I would first of all like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity, and I'm extremely privileged because we have here very well experienced speakers. Beyond the limits, we need these transformations. Thank you very much. That's all.
Thank you so much. I think there's a great deal of take-home messages which we'll include in the summary. What I would suggest now that we go to the next presentation by Professor Saleemul. of Bangladesh, which will be devoted to adopted developmental pathways for South Asian coastal cities.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor András, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. So my name is Saleemul. I'm the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development at the Independent University Bangladesh, speaking from Dhaka, Bangladesh. So greetings. I apologize for not having a PowerPoint presentation. I'll just speak and just share some thoughts. And I will do 3 sets of comments. The first set is on the recent IPCC 6th assessment report and its findings. The second set on South Asia, but specifically in the case of Bangladesh, my country, where we are facing climate change impacts to a very great extent. And then finally, some thoughts on how we can take things forward in the context of adapting in coastal cities in Asia more broadly going forward. So firstly, starting with the IPCC 6th assessment report, we had the Working Group 1 report come out in August last year, Working Group 2 report come out in February this year, and the Working Group 3 report just came out a few weeks ago. So the full 3 working groups have now reported, and it is a very alarming report of the IPCC. I used to be a lead author in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th assessment reports, and I wasn't a lead author in the 6th assessment, but I felt I had a good idea what it was going to say, but it came out much stronger in what it had to say than I had expected. It's no longer warning about climate change. It is saying climate change is happening. The Working Group 1 report, for the first time, the scientists said they had unequivocal evidence that climate change impacts because of temperature increase by over 1 degree centigrade, because of human-induced climate change, is now happening. And then Working Group 2 came out with hundreds of examples of these impacts, severe, record-breaking impacts of floods, cyclones, typhoons, heat waves, etc., wildfires all over the world taking place now, again, unequivocally attributable to human-induced climate change. And then finally, Working Group 3 report has come out with the window of opportunity to take action being much shorter than we had thought. So all the plans that people are making to 2050 are just useless. We need 2030 plans, and indeed we need 2025 plans to take action and on an emergency basis, which is simply not happening. So something that we all have to keep in mind. Now, given that scenario, the impacts of climate change are now real. They are happening all over the world, but in Asia in particular, we are probably one of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change across a broad set of regions, but I'll focus on the coastal zone and particularly the coastal cities in Asia. I think we have by far the biggest number of large megacities in the coastal areas in Asia, ranging from Jakarta and Shanghai in China to Calcutta in neighboring India, and so on and so forth. And then there are many smaller towns as well. So these coastal living conditions in the Asia Pacific region is something that is a particularly important arena for thinking about dealing with the impacts of climate change and adapting to them, but also going beyond adaptation now that loss and damage is happening, also finding ways to deal with what we call losses and damages from the climate change impacts. You will have seen in the news in the last 3 days, in particular in Durban in South Africa, they have had a severe flooding that is now being attributed to climate change that has taken the lives of quite a large number of people and devastated the slum dwellers in the north of Durban. So these are now regular phenomena happening all over the world, and in all of our countries, we will know examples of this. So we need to take this much more seriously. Number one point, that we have not been taking it seriously enough. We've been doing a lot, but it's not enough. And we've been doing it too slowly. We now need to speed it up. So that's the number one message that I would share with everybody. The second message coming out of the IPCC Working Group 2 in particular, which has also the main message being we need to do more adaptation. We're not doing enough adaptation. It needs to be speeded up and enhanced. But there's a second order message in there that is also very important for us to take note of, which is that they have studied a lot of adaptation projects and programs around the world. And to a very large extent, quite a large number of them, a surprisingly large number of them, were not proved to be effective. And in fact, some of them proved to be maladaptive. They caused more problems than they were designed to solve. And while there are many reasons for these lack of effectiveness, one very big reason that is almost a universal, if not a completely universal reason, is that the designs of projects are done in a very top-down manner, either by national governments and national experts, or international bodies and international experts like the World Bank and the UN agencies and other international funding agencies. They decide what needs to be done. They come with their ideas and their plans. They then impose those ideas and plans on local communities and local people and insist that the local people now have to do that. And in the end, they don't prove to be effective. So one of the lessons from that is that in future, adaptation plans have to be much, much, much more consultative with the local populations, the most vulnerable populations. And in the adaptation arena, we call this locally led adaptation. And this is a growing area of work, and people are accepting that this needs to be done. They accept that they have not been able to do it effectively. They accept they need to change, but they are not changing fast enough. And so my final comments that I would like to share with you is how do we enhance collectively, all of us, knowledge of the local adapters, because they actually are knowledgeable about adaptation because they're having to do it and they're surviving by doing it. If they don't survive, then they die. And many of them do, but many of them survive. And they have knowledge of survival that is an important skill set that we need to be tapping into, that we need to recognize, and we need to bring into designing adaptation programs and projects that are top-down with their funding from national or international sources, but in consultation, a genuine consultation with the vulnerable communities themselves, so that they have a say in design, they have a say in implementation, and they have a say in evaluation of the effects of that interventions over time. And I'll finally share a bit of experience from my country, Bangladesh, where we have a very large coastline with about 30 million people. The whole country is about 160 million people living on the delta of two of the biggest rivers in the world, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, with a total area of less than 150,000 square kilometers. So the whole country density of population is about 1,200 people per square kilometer, which is usually the density of a city. This is for the whole country. And in the coastal zone, around 30 million people are very, very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, including salinity increase, flooding and cyclones, etc. And one of the things that we have already started doing is developing what we call climate resilient, migrant friendly towns, to avoid all the people from the low-lying coastal zone ending up in Dhaka city. Dhaka city, the capital of Bangladesh, is the fastest growing megacity in the world. It cannot absorb another 10 million climate migrants, which is the figure that is being sort of estimated over the next decade. And so what we are looking at is how we can have these towns, these people move not to Dhaka, but to other towns where we can make the conditions for them. On the one hand, build infrastructure that makes those towns climate resilient. On the other hand, make those towns, people of those towns, the host communities, into migrant friendly towns. So we call it climate resilient, migrant friendly town development. And we've identified a couple of dozen towns, and we've already started doing this work in a few of them. We would be very happy to share more information with everybody and enable people to share more information on what people are doing at the local level in the different cities and towns in the coastal areas in the countries represented here. So maybe I'll stop there and hand back to the professor.
Thank you so much, Professor Haq. This is extremely interesting. I hope you will be able to stay with us until the end of the question and answer period, because now we are turning to the last presentation on blue economy and coastal agriculture risks from rising salinity levels. And the presenter will be Dr. Da Silva, a senior environmental specialist with the World Bank in Washington, DC. Madam, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor András, and thank you for the organizing committee for inviting me for this very important discussion. And I'm very happy to be part of this eminent group of people, experts who are here today. So good afternoon to everyone. It's good morning for me, actually. I'm based in Washington, DC currently. So today I've been asked to talk about two different topics in a certain sense, but they are, of course, mutually inclusive to some extent. So one on blue economy and the other one on agriculture risk from rising salinity levels. Let me see. Okay. Oceans, if you treat like a country, is the 7th largest economy in the world with an estimated value of 2.5 trillion. There is a global understanding that coastal countries can really harness this potential through improved efficiency in our land and ocean management, better treatment of governance of marine ecosystems, a more equitable model of standards, low emissions, and resilience against climate change. Since 2012, when the concept of blue economy was formally introduced to our vocabulary, there have been many definitions. The World Bank defines it currently as the sustainable use of ocean and coastal resources to drive economic growth and improve livelihoods while protecting and nurturing healthy marine ecosystems as the blue economy. It is regarded as the decoupling of socioeconomic activities and development from environmental degradation and optimizing the benefits which may derive from coastal and marine resources. Despite the environmental and economic benefits, a growing number of natural and human-induced threats to this precious resource continues unabated. This audience is well aware of these, and some of this was also discussed by the previous speakers, which include, among others, climate change, environmental pollution, unsustainable fishing and mining practices, unregulated coastal development, dumping of solid and liquid waste, which pose grave threats to marine life and people and undermine the productivity of our oceans. Recognizing these growing threats to the ocean have resulted in an increase in global blue initiatives. So there's a lot of initiatives that is taking place across the world, even within the South Asia region. And this is a very important thing. Given the wealth of biodiversity and its natural resources, the potential for a vibrant blue economy is especially high in South Asia. And the coastal states have every right to explore and use resources in their maritime boundaries because you can't, I mean, it's their resources and it's important that they have the ability to use it. South Asia being home to nearly 1.7 billion people, its vast array of natural resources and rich biological diversity are in great dangers of overexploitation and destruction. And there's a lot of evidence and a lot of studies that have been done that actually confirm this situation right now. Though the region is famous for its fisheries and aquaculture, tourism, shipping, and other ocean-based industries, it is unclear whether their operational practices meet the expectations of the blue economy principles. In order for the blue economy to be really harnessed, there are certain principles that needs to be adhered to. Facing all of these issues and much more to come in the future, South Asia should aspire towards solutions in terms of management plans, regulations, and collaborative approaches to sustainably secure its maritime interests. Governing ocean space towards a sustainable blue economy is a task to be achieved as a region, of course, with local actions. This means establishment of domestic integrated marine policies to overcome the issues of poorly harmonized policies, which are currently present, lack of coordination and duplication of duties among various institutions that gets created to look into these ocean and coastal based activities that are taken in given country. National policies have to be upgraded in order to include the value of the blue capital and accompany with people's right to live in a safe and secure environment. Strong political willingness is the key to be adhered to the commitment of the treaties. With more quantitative research, it is necessary to formulate marine sector-wise national databases to elaborate how the sectors are performing and what measures to be taken in the future. Because the research is a very important thing if you are to really do this right, to manage the blue economy in a manner that it doesn't become a detrimental situation to a country or to the entire region itself. Then in addition to that, it's important to have uniform ratification of international agreements within the region and close some of the loopholes that may be there and promote regional good ocean governance practices. The process of high seas are poorly observed in the South Asia region in particular. And this has been the case for a long time, although there's been a lot of efforts being done to reduce this gap to some extent, to make sure that some of the processes are improved to a great extent. So this requires a collaborative approach and in managing activities and conducting research because the high seas are universally owned and out of the maritime borders, there's a shared space that are universally owned. So the bottom line is that South Asia has potential and scope for implementing the blue economy, but strong political commitment, plenty of research, societal awareness, and attitude to balance the dependency are really required to achieve this potential fully. So unless some of these aspects are taken into consideration, it's difficult to make the change that is needed or to get the potential that may be there through the blue economy. And as the last speaker, Professor Huck, was indicating, one of the key things is the ownership. I mean, he's right to some extent when you say that, international organizations comes and tells countries what to do. And this tends to happen because there's very little preparedness from a lot of the countries in order to really have a, meaningful negotiation with the financing entities that wants to come and put money. So that preparedness is important, and that preparedness can be only done if, of course, the country has enough information, and this needs to come from the research activities and this, focusing on the right research by institutions is also very important in that sense. So I will now move into the next topic, which is on the impact of rising salinity levels on the coastal agriculture. So agriculture is, as all of you know, is one of the most important key economic sectors, especially today with the growing threats across the world on nutritional and food security. However, the sector is threatened by both anthropogenic factors and the climate change impacts, and also the current status of the world in terms of the financial challenges that are coming in. The war situation in certain countries is actually threatening some of the countries who are importing food into the country. So the need to really make best use of the arable land that is there and to see how the agriculture sector can continue to be productive within a given country is a very important thing. So some of the threats are more challenging and solutions are often not easy. One of the challenges in this respect is the effects of saltwater intrusion on coastal agriculture land as a result of sea level rise along the coast, as well as when storm surges occurs and high tides over top areas in low elevation. So in addition, saltwater intrusion can infiltrate freshwater aquifers and raise the groundwater table below the soil surface. And these all impact the coastal agriculture. If the land is at lower elevation and many acres of farmland can be lost every year because they are becoming too wet and salty to grow crops. And you can see, I mean, if I take Sri Lanka for an example, if you look at the southwest side of the country, there you can see the change. If you go along some of the rivers to the upstream of the rivers, you will see the change in the mangroves, how they are spreading more wide into the country, which more than what it used to be many years back. And this is also the same if you look at the northwest as well as the northern part of the country. You will see some level of some of the salt marshes are actually moving more into the country because of the salinity institution that seems to be taking place. And there is some studies that have been also done to really look at the impact and look at how much this is actually happening in certain part of Sri Lanka, for example. And I'm sure this information is also available in other part of the region. So so in this sense, the salt tolerant and marsh plants that border farm fields are moving inland and into the former fields in a process that is called marsh migration. Though farmers currently view marsh migration as a problem, it may also provide opportunities, and I will come to this a little bit later. Salt water can also impact water quality by unlocking nutrients from fertilizers in the farm fields, and this is due to the unique chemistry of salt water and how it interacts with the soil. Once these nutrients become mobile, they can travel through networks of agricultural ditches into larger coastal water bodies such as tidal creeks and marshes. And there is the excess nutrients that can cause excess algal growth. When the algae die, they are broken down by bacteria. This process can also use up all of the oxygen in the waters. Depleting the oxygen levels can result in fish kills, loss of animal habitat, and other harmful effects on coastal ecosystems and wildlife. So what can farmers really do to adapt to this situation? Because this is very important. There are a few strategies that can improve soil health and lessen the effect of saltwater intrusion in the short term. However, these are not long-term solutions. Farmers can remove excess salt from the soil through irrigation. Of course, natural rainfall events will also help with this process. Farmers can also add gypsum to decrease excess salt in the soil, use compost and manure production with low salt levels. So these are some of the farm level activities that farmer can actually adopt. But some of it can be actually expensive depending on the situation in the country, the cost of for example, if you take gypsum, the cost of the gypsum and things like that can impact, and the farmers may not be able to really afford this. Then there is also cover crops which help salt to leach down through the soil by increasing the flow of water, and it can also be grown on affected fields for one season. In addition, farmers may be able to continue generating income on land impacted by saltwater intrusion by planting different crops. Planting certain native plants can also help to prevent or slow the migration of undesirable or invasive species, and native plants can provide other valuable ecosystem services, which also was discussed by some of the previous speakers on the importance of native plants as nature-based solutions. Another method of adapting to saltwater intrusion is to add in conservation practices on or next to salt impacted fields. These practices can provide wildlife habitat, protect and improve water quality, and may become income sources too in some situations. They could be also grown as value-added biomass crop for mulch or biofuel. However, eventually fields used to grow even salt-tolerant crops will no longer be farmable because the soil will become too wet. When this happens, the land can be turned into marsh habitat and placed into a conservation easement program. Because, one of the things that one can do is to make sure that you balance in a sense that if the solutions, the immediate solutions are not going to work out, that you come up with an alternative solution that may be beneficial to the farmers. Of course, there's also the attitudinal change that would be needed from the farmer side in order for them to really do some of this shifting, which is not going to be easy because, once, especially the farmers, when they're used to a certain way of doing things or farming itself, the change that they may want to do from a livelihood point of view might not be that easy to change. So it takes time. So there's a lot of preparation that needs to be done, a lot of consultation that needs to be done, providing a lot of the knowledge that is needed, creating the awareness is extremely important if you really want to see the change happening in order for you to, if you want to protect these farmers from the possible impact of as the subject is on the saltwater intrusion. So then there's also, the salt marshes also provide high recreational value to coastal states. Therefore, it can be cost effective for states to provide incentives to farmers to create salt marshes in their property from salt affected farmland, because this can become a tourism attraction. You can make it for both local as well as international tourism if you manage it well. And there are examples, while not necessarily right onto the coast in Sri Lanka, this has been done in Colombo City, where certain areas have been changed into recreational areas in order to get much more benefit that is needed while protecting the situation on the ground. And this is actually more linked to as a means of flood management. So the similar principle can be used. And again, I refer back to the nature-based solutions that was discussed related to Mauritius as well as Maldives, which are very critical. And these are the things that one needs to start focusing on as easement to the situation that would be happening on the ground. But these solutions to be adopted at the right place and the right time is only possible if there's adequate science to support the decision making. Research that focus on tracking salinity changes over time in groundwater wells and surface water, economic impacts of potential crop losses, etc., and related adaptation strategies will become critical in this process. So unless you have the right science, and it is difficult to convince people of the change that needs to happen, including the decision makers, because they need to know where they need to put their money, and the money and the resources are often scarce. And so the more information that you have, you can make the right decision on what type of a solution one needs to put in to resolve whether it is saltwater intrusion or any other impact that may be happening because of the vulnerabilities that we are currently facing and we will continue to face because of climate change. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Madam. We have now reached the formal presentations, the end of it, and have 20 minutes question and answers and discussion. If anybody has any question or comment from the audience, please share that with us. Jesse, the best would be if people send it to the chat room, or they simply raise their hand? Because I don't see here the participants.
Yes, or we can proceed with the question and answer. Like we have 2 questions for Dr. Assela Pathirana.
Lovely.
So the first question is, how have the multi-stakeholder workshops benefited the adaptation process taken up by the Ho Chi Minh City government?
Assela, would you kindly deal with this question?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very useful question because, sometimes we look at this multi-stakeholder collaboration as a, political point that, for a grant proposal or a project that is certain IFI is proposing, we have to do that. But it's more than that, because especially focusing on this Ho Chi Minh City's case, what we realize is that, this is a problem that was impacting multiple domains, and the solution to which is also impacting multiple domains. Like, for example, there was a very clear possibility in the short term to release more water in the Saigon River during the dry season, so that the salinity will be pushed down to the ocean. But what is the impact of that? Agricultural water supply will diminish. So, I mean, this kind of interactions need to be assessed. And if a solution is going to be acceptable and, sustainable in that sense, that, people will live with that for a foreseeable future, then incorporating these ideas are very useful. So what we did was we invited, my colleagues and myself, we went around 5-6 people from the so-called global north, and we invited about more than 60-70 people from different stakeholder organizations, including the water supply, including the municipality, including agriculture, hydropower people, and not only that, but also community organizations, the water consumer groups, these kind of people together. And the designs and the process has been done together with the participation of all these people. And it's a challenging task to do that. I mean, it's much easier for an engineer to sit down and look at her guidebooks and do a design. And it's much more difficult to come to a consensus. But once you do that, that solution can become much more sustainable than the former.
All right. There's another question, the second question. I don't know whether can you deal with that, Assela?
Yeah. Do you know of any adaptation strategies similar to the workshops you mentioned in Vietnam, where local governments in South Asian country has involved different stakeholders and community members? If not, how could our governments involve more citizens in the adaptation process? It's a very good question, but my experience with this kind of process in South Asia proper is limited. And I guess there are reasons for that, but I have done very interesting processes also in Indonesia, and it worked really well, and some very interesting anecdotal lessons were learned as well. One of the issues, I mean, if I may venture into a territory that I don't have too much knowledge as an engineer, but I think our cultural biases is towards the experts know best, and rest of us or rest of you has to admit what experts say. So oftentimes we try to use terms like stakeholder sensitization or communicating to stakeholders, but I tend to look at it much more fundamental way, like from day one you have to include these stakeholders, multiple stakeholders, and it's very challenging. I mean, there are some success stories. I mean, one case that I know very well of is that in the case of Netherlands, there was this mega project called Room for the River. One of the projects that finished on time, actually early, on budget. And there they did the massive scale of multiple stakeholder engagement, which worked really well. And that is the reason why I presented that little tool that I told you about, that, making these models accessible to other people and so on, because, when you are when you are doing a negotiation, you can shout at each other saying that my opinion is right and the other is right. But if you have quantitative information that you can play with, that can help quite a lot to break these barriers about hierarchy, seniority, and everything. And so it's not so sensitive for somebody to be wrong or right then, because it is the model that says. So I believe quite firmly that, bringing these very sophisticated models to the level of stakeholders is a very much of a necessary condition. And we are doing some work on that. I mean, I can share with you some of the tools that we have designed and implemented as web applications, where we, people can play with different scenarios and try to understand, how things work at a very basic level. And sometimes that works in these kind of situations.
Yeah, there is a question. Thanks a lot, Assela. There's a question addressed to you with respect to the melting of the glaciers, particularly the Himalayan glaciers, because that will contribute to raising the sea level. Do you have any suggestion how to prevent melting glaciers? I don't think that you can prevent the melting.
Yeah, probably. This is not my area of expertise, but I think without controlling the temperature, global temperature at that, yeah, we cannot prevent the melting. So it's same as the polar ice caps. So that's very clear. So I think for that, all the focus should be levied on controlling the global temperature, hence greenhouse gas control,
which is a long-term process.
Yes, long-term process, and we have to adapt in the meanwhile.
Yeah, well, that may have an impact on coastal zones in the long run, but the short-term impact is basically some of the glacier lakes that, as a result of the glacier melting, could lead to a dam break. Yes. And generate major disasters. We have seen quite a number of that in the Himalayan region. Let me just go to the next. Thanks a lot, Assela. Let me just go to the next round of questions. Then, Jansi, if you could kindly project that. Professor Sunita, here is a question for you.
What are the limitations of implementing nature-based solutions to mitigate coastal risk? Yes, there are quite a few constraints. Essentially, as has been mentioned by previous speakers, very often we don't have the evidence base. We don't have the sufficient scientific data to be able to convince policymakers, decision makers, and even at the community level. So we need to have a very strong evidence base, which often we don't have. This also leads to another issue, that there is a lot of uncertainty about how effective these solutions are in the long term, because it's all done through modeling, it's all done through predictions. So we don't really have something as a demonstration where you can actually demonstrate something like we can do for short-term projects, because this essentially is a long-term thing. So then there is a lot of uncertainty, and then it becomes difficult to convince the different stakeholders. We also don't have tools to measure the long-term performance. Also, the cost benefit is usually done only in monetary terms. So the intangible benefits, the co-benefits on other ecosystems, or even the co-benefits for the very, or the benefits of the very solution itself, is often not there. So the intangible benefits are not taken into account, and we don't have tools to be able to measure these intangible benefits. Also, very often we can't do a transfer of technology approach, something which has worked in one area, maybe even in the same country or in another country, and we try to adapt it. It doesn't always work, because every nature-based solution has to be site-specific, because by its very nature, it is something that is specific to that place, to the ecosystem, and therefore you have to develop these solutions for each case individually, which then becomes, first of all, it becomes quite a long process. It's also not very cost-effective because every project is different. So that's another constraint to it. What we have seen in Mauritius also is that where you have both public and private sectors involved, then the responsibility, the ownership becomes a bit of a matter of contention. We will have all the documentation, we will have all the legislation and everything put in place, but still on the ground, often there is clash, there is conflict. So then that is another issue, that because when you're talking of plants, then who actually is going to take care of the plants? It's not like a concrete structure, you build it, it is there. Nobody necessarily has to look at it for years, unless it's time to actually maintain or paint it or whatever. But when you're talking of plants, you're talking of nature-based solutions, then the question of who's going to look after the plants, who's going to irrigate them, who's going to add fertilizer, who's going to add pesticides, and things like that. Okay, the dunes also require some maintenance. Corals, we are going a lot for mangrove cultivation, mangrove plantation and coral cultivation. Now, these are living things. Who's going to maintain them? The mangrove forest, the coral gardens. So there is a bit of conflict there. Even though we do work out everything in the initial stages, on the ground, there is still some clash.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay.
Please
Okay, all right.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Please go ahead.
No, I was just going to add one last point that for us, I mean, in our specific context and even for other island states, land is limited. And for nature-based solutions, you often require large areas, coastal areas, or sometimes even offshore. And then the question of availability of land area, talking terrestrial area, may simply not be available or may be too expensive. They have other uses, multiple uses for the land, especially in a country like Mauritius. All the best beaches are taken by the hotels. So if you want to talk of setting up, say, a constructed wetland or a large-scale nature-based project, then there's a conflicting use of the land. Should it go for an economic activity like tourism, building another hotel, or should we then sort of keep that land, protect that land, conserve it for a nature-based solution for coastal resilience? So these multiple uses of land then becomes another area of conflict. So these are some of the major constraints, major limitations that we have for nature-based solutions. But of course, having said all that, there's always a solution to everything. So, and where we are now with climate change, we are all, I think, especially after the AR6, we are all, or we should be, I should say, if you're not, we should be in agreement of what we need to do for the bigger good. So these small, petty, very monetary kind of very, profit-oriented kind of mentality should change for the better good of the planet. So that's where we are at the moment.
That's absolutely true. Because one of the limitations, perhaps we ought to spell it out clearly, one of the limitations of implementing nature-based solutions is politics, is local politics, because the issue, as Professor Facknath has mentioned, can become very political. For instance, a lobby that is representing the interests of the hotels in order to generate short-term economic benefits versus the local population that has a long-term interest of making that particular coastal zone livable. So there is a time scale, a difference, the short-term profit versus the long-term sustainability for the benefit of the people. And that is not easy. And one of the ways or perhaps the only way of circumventing that conflict is by the inclusion of the public. So public participation in the decisions of long-term and short-term projects, I think it's a must. It's a very conflictual area, particularly as there are some political forces who still deny the existence of climate change, and they say this is a short-term phenomenon. So perhaps one of the ways we need to tackle this is through public education programs. Now, this is not just about generating a quick buck, as they say, but rather think of the next generation, think, 80 years down the road, when we will have a totally different ball game. So as Professor Sunita has mentioned a couple of times, and I don't think that we could in any way disagree with her, is that the nature-based solutions is a must of survivability of humanity. Thank you so much, Professor Sunita. Let's go over to this is a general question here, right?
Yes.
The Himalayas business, we have discussed that. It's not only the Himalaya, but think in terms of the, melting the polar ice and the glaciers elsewhere. The glaciers are depleting. The glaciers are tracing back. So for some time, we will be able to enjoy the benefit of extra flow, quote unquote, because that may contribute to the excess water. But when the glaciers not disappear, but at least they drag back significantly, then often it will happen that there will be no flow at the upper part of the catchment into the river system. So therefore, there will be a recession period. The recession curve will set in, and the flow conditions, the discharge, will be much less than before. So these are the questions that certainly are linked to that. But the same is true with the permafrost. If that melts out, then we will have a big problem. Next question.
Thank you, Professor András. Now that's the end of the Q&A round. So next we have the closing remarks by Chair. Professor, can you please continue it?
Well, that was almost like a closing remark, Smitri. I think this was an extremely interesting session, and I should thank all the speakers for the wonderful ideas which they have transmitted. What I learned from most of the presentations is that a multidisciplinary approach is required to deal with the coastal ecosystem problems. It's not only the local solution to deal with the stability of the coast, the control of the erosion or the coastal erosion, but the causes are further up. Well, as one of you have mentioned, has mentioned rightly, for instance, in the melting of the glaciers as a result of the climate change. So most of the speakers emphasize the multidisciplinarity, an approach that requires not only engineering and hydrology, but does require conflict analysis and resolution through public participation, get those involved who are or will be impacted by those projects. A particular concern was expressed by number of speakers. That concern was the groundwater lenses in small islands. So if the sea level is rising, then there will be saltwater intrusion into the groundwater lenses, and basically the freshwater will be pushed out literally from the groundwater lens. So here is the thing, what again, I think we all as professionals need to convince the political community that you may build up nice hotels along the shores of a small island, but if the hordes of tourists are coming and they're pumping out the water from the saltwater lands, then that saltwater reservoir will be gone, and the only option what you have is desalination. But as Assela has mentioned, that this is not a panacea, because it has lots of open questions with respect to the management of the brine, So from whatever direction you look at it, this requires not only hydrology, but also political science and the involvement of the public. We have been complaining a lot that the huge disaster is coming, and 100 years down the road we will reach the sustainability limits unless we do something about it. And one of the vehicles is the reinforcement of the Sustainable Development Goals program. Hopefully, midterm review next year will help us do that. Next to the negative messages, most of you had positive messages also included in the presentation, namely that we have monitoring technologies that are cheap. It's not only the remote sensing, LIDARs and the online systems, but we also have what we call loosely the citizen science, with all this interconnectedness that we have through the internet and digital cameras. We have so many data, we can have so much data accumulated that we never had it before, and these technologies became cheap. And also we noted a positive development in terms of modeling and the visualization of the processes and the ability to forecast what will likely happen. We could have never even imagined that, even 30 years back. So these things help a great deal to bring the issues and the potential solutions to the public. The important thing is that I hope that will go down in the political thinking process, that climate change is not anymore a threat. Climate change is with us. And then those who will suffer the most are the ones who cannot cope with it because they don't have the means. And that's basically the underprivileged classes, the poor. So we need to have policies, and we need to have socially sensitive politics in order to help those people, particularly in the developing countries. Many of you have emphasized the need for hybrid solutions, namely to combine the hard approaches with the soft approaches, hardcore engineering with nature-based solutions. Well, basically, I think this is what I have learned from the session, and I have learned a lot. There is hope. There's no reason to give up. Perhaps sometimes some of us painted the picture a little bit too gloomy. But once again, human ingenuity have helped a great deal. We never have thought 40 years back that discharge of a river could be measured remotely, provided that you have a digital, three-dimensional digital terrain model. And we have those models available. We have the computational power, which we haven't had before the mid-90s. And we have the interconnectedness that internet provides. So what I think, what I gathered from the excellent presentations we heard is we have the means. And what is lacking is the political will. The important thing is to liaise and cooperate with the political community, because now things could be presented to the political decision makers in a way that has never been available before. The science policy interface needs to be strengthened. Science is not anymore just a backroom boys' hobby, but it became a very, very practical thing. The results of it, everybody can understand. You don't need to know the hyperbolic, parabolic differential equations of the gradually varying flow and the finite element schemes you use, but you will see the results. You will see the motion of how the velocity field, for instance, is changing in function of various boundary conditions, how you go about with your engineering design. So I would like to close with an optimistic message in this regard. We need to reinforce the science policy interface, because unfortunately, still in many parts of the world, policies, water-related policies, including, of course, the coastal zones, water resources policies are based on outdated science. So what we need to do is to close this gap. That's doable because we have the computational power. And thanks to you guys, we also have the brain to do that. Once again, I would like to thank the contributors to the wonderful presentations, and I will try to summarize the basic messages Friday when we will close the session. Thank you so much. Back to you, ladies.
Thank you, Professor András, for that insightful remarks. And Dr. Assela, we saw you raised your hand. So do you have anything to add on?
No, I think it's not important at that stage, because I don't want to, dilute the message, the very important message that András related to. So we can stop it there.
Thank you, Assela, Dr. Assela. So thanks a lot to all the participants, speakers, and our chair, Professor András, for chairing the session. And thank you all for joining this webinar. So next, on 21st, we have the webinar 3, which is on the theme on transforming food systems in South Asia, finding best strategy, policies, and practices in tackling hunger and malnutrition. So it will be from 14 to 17:45 Indian Standard Time on Thursday, 21st April. I invite all to also join this webinar 3. And thank you all. And I also invite all to join us for the closing on the 29th April. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.